Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry and our role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. We are at a pivotal time, the time I am calling the moment, and forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple and quick energy transition. And I'm talking to guests in and around and outside the oil and gas industry about what this means for you, the oil and gas leader. I'm really delighted to share today's program with you. I spoke with Matt Yglesias. He's a writer at Slow Boring. He's a veteran content creator, and he has an expertise in American politics and public policy. What an interesting time to have that conversation. I find him to be a brilliant thinker, and I hope that I'm the one that has gotten to introduce him to you in today's show. If you'd like to hear more from me, please go to energythinks.com and subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. You can learn more about Matt in our show notes. I think you're going to find really interesting our conversation near the end about what stakes get higher as we have more success in decarbonizing the energy system. Now, here's my conversation with Matt Yglesias. Matt Yglesias, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm a big fan of your work and of your Substack, and I'm hoping that a lot of the Energy Things listeners aren't familiar with you, because then, one, I'll get credit for introducing you to them, but also hopefully we're going to expand the world of ideas and thoughts that we're exploring here.
Yeah.
I'm hoping we could just start with Slow Boring, your newsletter. Can you introduce Energy Things listeners to, like, what are your objectives? What are you trying to accomplish there? And what's up with that name?
Yeah. So Slow Boring, you probably have listeners who are involved in the non-metaphorical drilling industry. This is part of a quote from the German sociologist and political scientist Max Weber, who he said that politics is the slow, boring of hard holes. So it's a difficult process, is his point. And, there's a whole bit in this essay. He says it takes passion and perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So, I am trying at Slow Boring to get people who are interested in politics, interested enough to subscribe to, a newsletter about politics and policy, to think more analytically and less emotionally, less expressively about their political ideas. Because I think that ultimately we make progress on issues that are important. I think for your audience, climate is probably the most relevant one, by thinking carefully that there's an assumption often among people who are on the left that if there's something you care about a lot, the way to make the most possible progress on that is to take the most strident possible position and to just kind of like pound the table and talk about, this is the most important thing ever. We can't compromise at all. And I think history tells us that that's not actually how you make progress on important issues, that you have to take into consideration the full set of equities that are at stake in all these different things, work with people, try to be reasonable, actually, and, win voters over to your side, manage things responsibly. And I think energy, in a way, is at the core of this, where, the climate concern that a lot of my friends on the progressive side have is real. But energy is very complicated. The availability of energy is very important to people's living standards, to national security, to many other things. And the view that just kind of dogmatism is going to maximize progress, even just narrowly on climate, is not true, because there are so many other stakeholders who have completely valid interests in play. And unless you can acknowledge that, understand that, work with everybody, you're gonna break your sphere, essentially. You're not going to make a headway on things that are important to you.
I thought I knew what I was asking you with that question, but I didn't, because what a gift that actually the Slow Boring is related to drilling holes. Like I did not know. I'm delighted. It seems to bode well for the conversation we're about to have.
I mean, of course, real ones know that boring and drilling are like technically different in English. In German, it's only one word. So.
Well, I mean, at least you've invoked what I think of as the rocket science of the subsurface. So it's exciting to us. It's not boring, but
There you go.
The interesting work that you allude to is boring, and in some ways you're putting boring in contrast to emotional. And so I want to let's pull on that thread, because we've certainly experienced a lot of emotion in this topic of energy and climate. And you and I were together in DC last month, and you were the target of a very enthusiastic protest around your support of fracking, which well, it was just interesting in a lot of ways, right? Like if I was going to protest someone on fracking, you're not the place I would start, for one. So just wanted to ask you, like, do you support fracking?
Yeah, I mean,
so how did that go?
So, I mean, it's a funny confluence of events because, what happened is that, of course, there was a question as to whether Vice President Harris wanted to ban fracking. And she said, no, she didn't, which is also the position of the Biden administration. And I wrote an article saying that I thought most Democrats accepted that position from Harris, from Biden, but that they thought of it as a political concession that had to be made to win votes in Pennsylvania, which it is. But I said that I wanted Democrats to consider that Vice President Harris's position was correct, right? That this wasn't just a kind of giveaway to potentially imagined swing voters in Pennsylvania, but that it was good for America to not ban fracking, and that people should understand the case for the vice president's position. And I think in an interesting way, that's what set off the protest, right? That there's a kind of grudging willingness from progressives to acknowledge that Pennsylvania is an oil and gas state and that they wanted to win the pivotal electoral votes there. But they didn't want to hear that the Pennsylvania voters who don't think you should ban fracking are correct. But I do think they're correct. And, so like, why protest me? In some ways, it seems so silly, right? I mean, you could protest like an actual oil company.
Right.
But the idea is to create this dead space where if you want to be a Democrat in good standing, you're not allowed to say that like it's beneficial, that as long as the world is using oil, it's better for America for that to be American oil rather than Venezuelan or Iranian or Russian or Saudi oil. Even though I think the case for that is like really clear and strong and on some level accepted by the Biden administration, but to a frustration I think moderate Democrats had with the Biden administration all along is that they wouldn't articulate the basis for what they were doing, even as they, landed in, I think, a much more moderate stance on this than they've often been given credit for. But one reason they didn't get credit is like they wouldn't say it, right? They didn't want climate defiance showing up at their panels and yelling and screaming. So, I mean, it's weird to be singled out for protest for just agreeing with the president's policy. But there's something to it.
Yeah, and let's explore it a little bit more because I had read your piece and then I watched you get protested and I couldn't connect the dots of, but I think at its heart, the connecting of the dots is on this thread of there's an absolutism to being a good Democrat and part of being a good Democrat and maybe even a good human is that you don't like oil and gas. And I interestingly sort of thought we were done with the fracking wars. Like I thought we'd moved on to just, I don't know, something else. But for you, it's particularly, dangerous. Maybe it's too strong of a word, but if you're on the left and you critique the left, it's much riskier than somebody else doing it. And I'm just wondering, how do you decide where to take a stand and where to be brave? And how do you articulate like the cost benefit analysis to yourself of where to come out and where not to? Because you have sort of you show a lot of courage in your writing, and I wonder how you decide to do that.
Well, I don't think it's actually courage. I don't face, people can show up and protest, and that was one of my best days for selling subscriptions. What I think I have is a certain disagreeability. Most people naturally don't like to fight with their friends. And so if you can reach a kind of a fudge where on the one hand, we're not banning fracking, but on the other hand, we're not saying the climate movement is wrong about anything, then that's just fine. And we can all just kind of get along. And I'm a bit of a jerk. So if there's a topic, but I think it's bad politics ultimately. I think that, if you're going to break with elements of your base, you should tell people that you did that, because, most people don't have particularly detailed opinions about all these different things. It's a little technical, but most people have a sense that there are ideological extremists in American life, that they have a lot of influence over partisan politics. And it makes you look better to say, listen, I share some of the concerns that people in the climate movement raise about the world and temperature trajectories, but I'm an independent thinker who is able to look at the evidence and make decisions on the basis of national interest. And I wish we had heard that from the vice president, not just it isn't true that I will ban fracking, but I went through this with my team. I was the Attorney General of California. I maybe didn't know a lot about energy economics. Nobody knows everything, but what I learned as vice president is that you have access to the top people in the world. You can get briefed on anything that you want. You take into account foreign policy, you take into account economics. And I decided that my former allies who encouraged me to take this position in the past were not correct. And that's why I took a different position. And that's good. I think we have all had the experience of being asked to give an opinion on a political topic that we don't actually know that much about, and kind of defaulting to agreeing with whoever it is we're talking to. And then you learn more in life, and the world has complexity. I've done that a million times. I think everybody has. And that it's important to have, space among columnists, pundits, take people like me to say that the world is full of complexity, and, the interest group coalition that you agree with over 50% of the time is not 100% of the time.
Well, you speak to a couple of things. One is a general honoriness, which maybe is a prerequisite for thoughtful engagement. I don't know. I'm
sure you're very nice.
I was actually reflecting as you were talking, is honoriness at the heart of my endeavors? It might be, it's possible. The second thing is a willingness to evolve one's thinking, right? That's at the real heart of what you're describing. But there is a third component, and I will put an emphasis on it because I think it's going to be required of us all in the months ahead, which I do think it requires a kind of courage to not go along to get along, because it is exhausting to have to narrate your rationale for not taking whatever the party line is incessantly. And so, and of course, you do that for a living. But I wanted to translate it a little bit to what it's like to work in the oil and gas industry, and just explore this a little further. So of course, if anyone listens to my podcast, they work in the oil and gas industry, but they're interested in decarbonizing. They're interested in the energy future. They're interested in all things that make the world better and the role they can play in it. So they're already a little on the outs of maybe at least the caricatures of the oil and gas industry. But if you work anywhere near oil and gas and you live somewhere that isn't just a bright red state, you are perennially being asked to defend the industry or expected to rationalize why you're evil and work in it. And so those kind of caricatures are sort of exhausting. And I'm always looking for ways to get past it, to get out of it, which requires two things: there to be room for the oil and gas industry out in, left-leaning politics, but also it means that oil and gas people like me and my readers and listeners can't act like caricatures of the oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
That's a big part of it. So you posted a really compelling piece on November 12th. We'll link to it in the show notes, called A Common Sense Democrat Manifesto. And it builds on these themes you're talking about of nuance, of growing your thinking. Can you talk again, like in the spirit of why you do what you do and where you decide to be courageous? Like, why did you write this, and what's at the heart of these 9 principles that you put forward?
I would say, looking across the long kind of arc of my career, because I'm 43 now, so I'm young enough that I'll still be in this game for a while, but I'm not so young anymore. And when I started, it felt like we were on a run where the left was like right about everything. George W. Bush took office. We had a terrorist attack. We had these incredibly misguided wars. He had, very ignorant positions about like evolution. Their approach to climate change was they were going to literally refuse to open an email from the EPA, which just stated that like it is true that carbon dioxide makes the planet warmer. It was very bad. But we've reached a point where, and so all this time, I thought left-wing people sometimes said things that weren't true, but it didn't feel like that mattered. And I think if you look at things ranging from the handling of policing in 2020, aspects of energy policy under Biden, the way housing costs have escalated, particularly in more liberal jurisdictions, that, we're at a point where it is meaningful and important to look at the kind of excesses of left-wing politics across a range of different topics. And, to have Democrats say that, like, I'm aligned on some level with the values of racial justice, economic egalitarianism, concern about pollution, but that, like, I don't agree with the furthest left interpretations of these issues, that I don't think we want to just yank as hard as we can and assume that somebody else will stop things from going off the rails. The way the Inflation Reduction Act came together, its energy provisions at least, I think is fascinating, where, I think that landed in a pretty good place. But the reason it landed in a pretty good place is that Senator Manchin made it land in a pretty good place, right? The White House was not driving the responsibility there. They were just kind of pulling with the knowledge that the median senator was from a coal state, had a strong interest in natural gas and nuclear. And that was fine. I mean, that was an acceptable policy outcome in a messy world. But after Trump winning and Republicans sweeping the Congress, it's like Democrats need to rebuild. And you need to rebuild a party that isn't like just 100% focused on yelling at Joe Manchin, but that is actually going to formulate inside itself a policy agenda that's politically viable and works on the merits. And there's a bunch of elements to that, but there's an important energy element.
I'm really interested in this idea because I think that this will also translate in the work I'm doing to how we talk and think about the worst excesses of the right, and where the right says things that aren't true, or even caricatures the oil and gas industry in a way that isn't true. Like we see this playing out in just the very subtle drill baby drill narrative where company CEOs have to say, well, we're actually have to be focused on returns. Like that's, and it turns out too much oil is actually not in any of our enlightened self-interest. So that's an interesting parallel. Now, most importantly to this conversation, your number 3 of your list of principles was climate change and pollution more broadly is a reality to manage, not a hard limit to obey. So this like sounds innocuous and common sense, but it's like almost like religious, like fighting words. So I'm
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk about it, and also what kind of response you're like. Why did you decide to take that on, and what kind of response are you getting from that?
Sure. I mean, I think that I had a couple conversations with people. I sort of have a background doing economic policy. And at places I worked before, like when I worked at Vox, we had a climate team that was like separate from the team that covered economic policy. And if you think about American economic policy 20 years ago, really what you needed to know about energy is that we were just huge net importers of fossil fuels. So fossil fuel prices were a negative shock to our terms of trade. And anything you could do to reduce fossil fuel consumption, people might not like for one reason or another, but it was just an economic benefit to the United States to reduce consumption. And the production side, the line was just going down, right? So there wasn't really a policy argument to have. And so I think we kind of set up that way. But since the big turnaround in American oil and gas production, you can't silo off economic policy from energy policy. These things are much too intimately related. But I would talk to people on the Harris campaign, have great conversations with them about lots of things. But when I would mention anything that touched on energy, they'd be like, I hear what you're saying, but that's like not in my portfolio. And that's just not a reasonable way to think about the system. Conversely, though, on the right, I mean, there's this impulse to try to say that, I don't know, that climate change is fake, or that it's not true that burning fossil fuels has health hazards for Americans. When obviously it is true. I mean, if I got like a big bowl of oil and put it in your living room and set it on fire, there would be a problem there, right? And so the left is correct about that, right? But the right way to think about that is the way we think about all kinds of pollution hazards, which is that, zero industrial activity is not good for the world. But industrial activity tends to generate pollution, and we want to minimize that pollution in a way that, advances human flourishing, right? But not okay, we shouldn't have any factories because then there's no smoke, right? Nobody should have a car because then there's no exhaust fumes. That we get that that's not correct. But if you kind of draw this line on a chart and you say, okay, 1.5 degrees, okay, we have an emissions pathway. Okay, that's a hard limit. We're currently on course to go way ahead of the hard limit. So just anything we can do that reduces emissions is good because we're driving off the cliff. That's just that's not true, right? It's both true that climate change is harmful and gross, and that on net, some things you do to reduce emissions are beneficial and others aren't. And you have to actually look at the facts of the situation. It's just not a radical idea, but is actually totally different from how the climate movement portrays the situation, and different from how the right portrays the situation, which is just ignore it.
I think there's so many interesting points in here. And one is that you have interwoven complex systems in a way that could be useful to think about. We have the complexity of the energy system, which means that energy transition is challenging. But we also have a complexity of an economic system to which energy is central. And I hadn't thought about interweaving, and then if you interweave two complex systems, there's just maybe more room for trade-offs, more room for nuance, more room for thoughtful conversation. The thing that there's a subtle point you made in your piece that I want to get you to talk about, because I'm still wrapping my head around how to translate it over to my work and the work we do on the right. And that is that Democrats need to make a small adjustment in how they talk about climate, but it has big ramifications. That's me paraphrasing.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Because it is if it is small, this maybe even if you just said the idea that oil and gas might have a role, that could be a small adjustment. But it is like, if I say that, I'm a climate denier out in the world. It is like fighting words. So can you talk a little bit about the small and the large ramifications, and how do we attack the small that seems like a place that we are unwilling to go?
I mean, if you look at what is actually happening, right? Like the Biden administration didn't shut down domestic fossil fuel production. In fact, it went up to a record level. You can look at, you're from Colorado, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Colorado has become a blue state. And at one point, Colorado Democrats were okay with oil and gas because it was a purple state and they had to win elections. It's become a blue state, but like Jared Polis, Michael Bennett, John Hickenlooper, like they understand that actually like it's good to have a Colorado oil and gas industry. New Mexico, same thing. Even California, right? The most liberal and most climate pill state. Like there's oil rigs in the city of Los Angeles, right? And so you got to ask yourself at some point, like, well, why is it, right, that these liberal politicians aren't shutting this stuff down? And it's like they clearly get, you can see from their actual behavior that they understand on some level that the environmental benefits of banning oil extraction in California would be minuscule, and that the economic harms would be gigantic, and that there might not even be any environmental benefits relative to regulating the industry a little bit more strictly than, Russia or Texas does. New Mexico, again, I mean, I talked to the governor of New Mexico. She's not eager to be like a loud and proud proponent of fossil fuels because she cares about her reputation in the national party. But she cares about New Mexico and the well-being of the people of New Mexico. So has completely moderate views on this. So, the change that needs to be made is real. But to an extent, it amounts to responsible political leaders admitting to what they clearly know, which is like, it would not be good to just eliminate the Colorado oil and gas industry. And so by construction, it wouldn't be good for the United States to eliminate the American oil and gas industry, right? And like say that and have the argument with people and explain, why it is that it's like, there's things we can do in the technological space to accelerate transition to other kinds of fuels. But, for the foreseeable future, like we want to have airplanes, we want to have maritime shipping, we want to heat homes in the coldest parts of the country. And like these things are most usefully done with liquid fossil fuels. So it's better to produce them responsibly, in like well-governed places. I mean, I don't need to convince, I think, your audience of this, but like to say it, to like, what are we doing, right? Like there is no plan in the Biden budget to like end passenger aviation in 3 years. So like, what are you doing, right? Like if we're going to keep having the airplanes, we need to keep having the jet fuel.
So this is an interesting way that you're not curmudgeonly, Matt. I just want to say for the record, which is that you're narrating an eminently reasonable idea that we all know, some cohort of reasonable people understand we need oil and gas for a long time. But there is this cultural virtue of being anti-fossil. So if you're the governor of any blue state, your job is to act like oil and gas is eminently over. And is it simply a matter of political courage to narrate something different? Or is there another interim step of some kind that's required? Now, industry supporters would say there needs to be a reckoning, right? A price spike, an energy crisis, or whatever. But those happen over and over, and that never changes, actually, this narrative. In fact, the oil and gas industry just becomes the reason bad things happen. So to live in the world where people just start talking rationally about oil and gas, who needs to lead that charge? Like, who are those people?
So to an extent, I mean, so it's me. Everybody needs to subscribe to my Substack. No, I mean, I think that it requires a more interdisciplinary approach than we have totally got. I mean, I talked before about the siloing of economic policy and energy policy into different buckets. And I think it's when you put those buckets together is where Democrats come to a more reasonable view. I mean, so you talked about price spikes, right? I think a telling moment in American political history is when gasoline prices surged in the summer of 2021. You did not have a single member of Congress. Nobody is so left wing that they said, this is really good that gasoline has gotten so expensive because it's going to reduce fuel consumption and therefore put us closer to our climate goals, right? So nobody said that. So you need to reason backwards from that. If your response to a spike in fossil fuel prices is going to be to yell at fossil fuel companies about how they're bad, fine. But you are saying that it is not politically sustainable to making gasoline expensive a policy goal. Fine. So then you have to look, well, if you did ban new oil and gas extraction on federal lands, what would happen? Like, gasoline would get more expensive. So if your reaction to actual gasoline price spikes is to deny that your policies had anything to do with it and to blame somebody else, you have to remember that when you're making policy decisions. Like, don't do things that, if you don't push for things that would generate spikes in these prices, and admit to yourself that, there's this tendency to cast the use of fossil fuels as if it's some kind of like a weird scheme that the producers like foisted on us. But it's obvious. I mean, when gasoline gets really expensive, people get annoyed. The reason people get annoyed is that it's a useful fuel for automobile. I mean, it's obvious, right? And look, I mean, probably people in the industry don't want to hear this, but like, electric car sales have been booming recently. America is currently keeping out the like cheapest and best-selling electric cars in the world, but that's probably not sustainable for that long. And if people have affordable electric cars available to them, they will probably buy them and will not use as much oil and gas. By the same token, though, like, we still need electricity. We have boats. I mean, there's all this other stuff. And that's, that's the modality of change, is that people will use oil and gas for as long as it is useful. And it's going to continue to be useful for the foreseeable future. I'm not an inventor. I can't tell you if at some point in the future it won't be useful, but it's very useful now. And there's nothing on the immediate horizon that's going to make it stop being useful. So we need to have a prudent, industry with regard to all the things that exist, right? I mean, there's labor issues, there's tax issues, there's this leakage stuff that people talk about. I mean, but that's just a normal business, right? Where if you let it go completely unregulated, like, someone's going to do something bad, but you don't want to destroy it any more than any other kind of business we have.
Well, and let me put you on the spot as a commentator on observing how people engage in this topic. What do you see the industry doing or could do that just would not be helpful to this pragmatic dialogue? Like, in what ways does industry play the part that makes it even harder to have this conversation about important and rational use of fossil fuel products?
I mean, you get a negative polarization. Like, people will call you or me climate deniers as this like slur against anybody who's trying to be reasonable. At the same time, like, there are all these people who are in fact climate deniers. Like, that is a real thing. President-elect Trump said that like it's a Chinese hoax, and like that's not true. It's clearly like the world is warmer than it used to be. The science on this is very, very clear. And it serves the short-term interests of people in the industry to kind of promote those sort of denialist narratives, but it ultimately generates higher levels of polarization around this topic and obscures. I mean, I think it makes the average Democrat or liberal person or just blue state politician be like, aha, there's a polarized argument. On one side are people who are saying something scientifically true, and on the other side are people saying something that's false. So I'm going to side with the people who say things that are true. And, that's not good. It is true that there are downsides to burning fossil fuels. There's just also upsides. And like, that's the case that has to be made. And it's in a way, it's more normal than I think people want to accept it to be. I live in a neighborhood with a lot of restaurants. And, there's smells from restaurant kitchens. There's rats associated with restaurant trash. If you just dump the grease from your fires like on the street, like that would be bad. You manage the industry, right? But you manage it for economic benefit. I mean, it would kill cities to just be like, well, we don't want these fryer smells. Like we're going to have no restaurants. Like that's stupid. But it would also be a disservice if the industry just like pretended that like nobody worries about parking, that nobody worries about smells, that nobody worries about drunk driving. I mean, these are real concerns that exist around, economic activity. And you need to, show that you're willing to work with people in the community who are willing to be reasonable about finding solutions to these things.
Yeah, I think you're making an important point, and we're sashaying toward the topic of the next book I'm writing, which is about this middle way and finding the middle way and not overcorrecting as an industry to any reaction, any polarized reaction. So, what I was imagining pre-election is that responsible civic and business leaders are now starting to understand that the energy transition is more complicated. That this is going to be a more difficult endeavor than they thought, and maybe there would be more willingness to have these nuanced conversations about trade-offs and time frame. Now, with the Trump presidency here in sharp relief, I think there's a lot of environmental activists, NGOs, who are thinking, what can we get done? Like now, progress is important over perfection. And so I'm curious if you see evidence that there are more spaces for reasonable conversations about the energy transition. And do you think that decarbonization is still more likely than not? Like, in this world.
I mean, I think there's lots of reasonable conversations that exist. We were at this great conference together. There's good organizations. I'm in a co-working space that I rent, and around the corner from me in this office is a Energy for Growth hub. There's lots of good people working on energy policy, lots of sane things happening. There maybe isn't enough, people checking their own allies, right? Like, Trump, even leaving aside the signs of pollution, he keeps saying things about the economics of oil and gas that aren't true, right? He's acting like there's just like a dial he can turn where like we'll just have $40 a barrel oil. But it's like everybody will go out of business if that happens. I mean, this, right? But people don't want to like say it, right? The people in the industry don't want to check people on the right. People on the left don't want to check people who are further to the left. And, we need to get beyond that. I think that if you have a realistic view of decarbonization, that a Republican presidency is not nearly as damaging to the cause as you might think, right? Because the limiting factor in decarbonization really is the technological ability to accomplish what we accomplish with fossil fuels with lower carbon technologies. Electric cars is probably the the critical technology that we have right now, right, where a lot of fossil fuels are burned to power people's cars. My car too. I'm part of the issue there. But a lot of people around the world are buying electric cars and having a nice time with it. There's some downsides to EVs in terms of charging, et cetera, but they have advantages, right? They're simpler to repair, et cetera, et cetera. I think that battery technology is clearly improving at a faster pace than internal combustion engine technology. And so, then you have to ask, it's like, well, what are the barriers to adoption of this? Maybe not that many at this point, and just kind of on and on it'll go. People have ideas about, advanced nuclear, about advanced geothermal, as a different kind of boring that might be out there. There are engineering questions as to whether that stuff will work, but there are also regulatory barriers to just like trying it. And, you're about as likely to get the regulatory changes you need on those alternative energies from a Republican as from a Democrat. Democrat might not do it because they just love regulation. Republican might not do it because policy is being controlled by the legacy oil and gas industry, but also they both might do it just because it's a good idea. And, other stuff on the consumer side, right? Heat pumps, like that's just going to keep happening or not based on the manufacturers making it work well. And then there's the kind of science fiction stuff, right? Like we need steel and concrete. You can't do that without fossil fuels now. There are people who have ideas. I say good for them. They have some investment. I think that's great. But like it doesn't work now. If you can make it work, that would be incredible. If you can't, then you can't, and we're going to have to see what happens. But I don't actually think who the president is has a huge, implication for like innovation in steel manufacturing.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that there are many other pragmatic conversations, because I do think we need to mindfully create a critical mass of central trade-off driven conversations. And I happen to be a big fan of the Energy for Growth Hub because I sit on their board. So I love
Even
their
better
work. Yes. So thanks for the shout out. We'll link to Energy for Growth Hub in the show notes. So what I heard you saying with regard to drivers is there will be innovation, there will be policy, to some extent, and there of course will be economics, right? What energy sources are most accessible and affordable? Are there other things? Do you think public opinion will drive interest in prioritization of decarbonization, given what we've seen recently? Do you think that will continue to be a priority given the very real risk profile of climate change and increased carbon emissions?
I mean, I think you see technology companies that want, they want to build data centers. Electricity demand is growing. They are clearly concerned, either on its own merits or as a public relations matter, about the idea that data center build out will like cook the planet, right? I mean, the commitments they're making around nuclear, et cetera, are all driven by that kind of thing. A Trump administration will, if anything, move public opinion to the left on climate issues, because that's just how the pendulum swings. So, business leaders who are located in blue states and have primarily liberal workforces are going to continue to be motivated by public opinion to be playing some kind of constructive role in decarbonization. I think the question is like, in a world where we're clearly not going to achieve these IPCC targets, right? Like, how can we rebuild? And I think the target-based reasoning was never constructive. But now that we're clearly not going to hit the targets, can we rebuild just a more reasonable conversation that's about the specific emissions impact of specific policy choices, which then lets you say, this meets cost benefit analysis, this doesn't, this does, this doesn't. Because the targets-based reasoning was, I think, very unhelpful, but it was impossible to get anyone to say that. Once you are just off the track, maybe you can kind of rehash it. But I always want to integrate more, right? It's like we have strategic competition with China. We have economic development in Latin America. There's so many pieces of the puzzle that you really want to integrate together, because climate is global, right? That's why it differs from a traditional environmental issue. It's not how much do you like the forest that's near your town versus somebody wants to cut the trees down and build something there. The impacts are fully global. The energy system is fully global. The economy is global. And so, you have to think globally, but also just act globally, because otherwise you're not going to achieve the things that you're trying to achieve if you don't operate in a global context.
Well, I think you're speaking to this idea that I'm obsessed with, but you also, in your writing, often challenge your readers to question their biases. So in my bias, I think that there's an inevitable rise of a kind of more practical environmentalism for all the reasons you said. Like when it seems like you're going to get nothing, something starts seeming like a pretty good idea, and you want to start thinking about how to get that something. But that's also my preference, and so of course I think it's inevitable. So I'm curious if you think that a rise of more of this practical environmentalism, practical climate action is likely, and either way, is there room for the oil and gas industry to participate in that, do you think? And if so, how?
I think the closer you get to meaningful decarbonization, the more important it becomes to be practical and reality based, right? That if you're 25 years ago, if a low carbon economy is completely hypothetical, you can just say whatever and throw up some solar panels on your roof, and it doesn't matter, right? It's like the more renewables that you have on your grid, the more the intermittency of renewables is actually important. And you have to think about it, right? The more you get people driving electric cars, the more you need to think about the fact that the electricity comes from somewhere. At the beginning, you can be totally starry-eyed. And so I think nothing is inevitable in life. But as long as we are making progress toward a low-carbon economy, which we have been making, you necessarily have to start thinking in a more realistic way about what that looks like. The only way it's possible to be as dreamy and abstract as people have been in the past is to be so far away that it's like, I don't need to think about that. Oh, what if it's cloudy? I don't care, right? But it's like the more renewable you get, the more, what is natural gas backup actually doing to make this system work is relevant. It's again telling, right? California has decided that they need to have state-owned natural gas peaker plants, not despite their emissions goals, but because of their emissions goals. And that's, an important form of pragmatism that I then unfortunately don't see the governor articulating, right? Like a lesson was learned, but he doesn't want to tell people the lesson that he learned. And I think that's unfortunate, but you do see people getting there, right? Like there is no state that is just like, oh, we have blackouts, 20 times a year because we let the Sierra Club make our energy policy. Like that's not going to happen, right? So we're either going to do nothing or we're going to do something that's pragmatic and workable. The industry, right? I mean, they just got their big win from Trump, I'm sure, are feeling great. But, the politics is always forward and back, forward and back, forward and back. The risk to American oil and gas isn't that we stop using oil and gas, but it's that we turn our backs on making it, right? Because you need fossil fuels. You don't actually need to be a fossil fuel producer. It would not be wise for the United States to go down that route, but that it would work, to just be 100% dependent on imports or something. That's like a bad choice. And, the industry needs to make the case for that, for the value of responsibly managed American production in a world where it doesn't matter what you or me or Elizabeth Warren or anyone else says. Like, we're going to keep burning fossil fuels as long as it's useful. But then, like, what are the advantages of making them here?
I think that's such an interesting point because I'm not sure there's a general sense that a Trump administration is a win generically for the industry, because industry needs predictability and certainty. And that's certainly the one thing we don't have in spades right now in terms of what's coming next.
Absolutely.
But I do think you make a couple really interesting points. And one I'm going to explore more in future writing, which is this idea that if you're a serious climate hawk, this gets harder the farther along you get. And therefore we all that's when we actually need to pay more attention, and the stakes get higher, right? Because now either the public will turn against you, as we see in some polling, or you could just backslide in some terrific way that we need to think about. So that's really interesting. The second point you raised, I want to give more thought to, is that maybe the rise of a practical environmentalism is inevitable, but it will be a secret practical environmentalism. And that, I don't think that can be successful, right? Like, for all the reasons we're talking about, if we're still saying one thing and doing another, that's alarming. So figuring out how to have the courage to tell the truth and critique and come to the middle is going to be a really important part of this. So thank you for those two insights. I'm going to spend more time thinking about. Okay, Matt, I've gotten to run a lot of questions by you, but I have one final question I ask all my guests, which is, what are you most optimistic about?
Oh, man. So I'm optimistic about a resurgence of common sense in the Democratic Party. I think I voted for Kamala Harris. I wished that she had won the election. But I think in terms of the intellectual projects that I'm interested in, that would have been a really difficult slog through exactly what you were talking about. Whereas Democrats are on the outs now, and I think it's an opportunity to make the case that we need to not only be pragmatic in some of our energy decisions, but say that we are being pragmatic and why. And a Harris administration wouldn't have done that. They were going to continue with the Biden trajectory of muddling along. I'm hopeful, genuinely very hopeful, that now people are rethinking things and willing to say, hey, wait a minute, like, how did we get crushed on this energy issue, even while domestic production was at a record high? Like, what did we do here? How did we have a technology neutral energy bill, but like, we didn't say that that's not what environmentalists wanted us to do, but we did something smarter because they were wrong. And so I think these are conversations that are happening right now. They're still happening a little bit quietly, but increasingly boldly. More people are reaching out to me because I'm the contentious jerk. And I think it's going to happen.
Well, Matt, thank you for a curmudgeon. You bring some nice optimism to this conversation. So
well, you asked me to be optimistic.
You're the optimistic curmudgeon. So, Matt, thank you for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's our episode for today. Thanks so much to you, our listeners, for your engagement with my work. And thanks to Matt for joining me. I really found compelling this idea of integrated complex energy systems and the need, but I'm kind of a nerd, as you know, and the need for thinking about complexity and trade-offs in multiple dimensions at once. So expect to hear more from me about that. It would be super helpful if you would take a moment to rate Energy Thinks, so other listeners in the oil and gas industry can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Give us 5 stars. That would be amazing. Please go to energythinks.com. And while you're there, subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'd like to thank my colleague, Kayla Chives, for making the Energy Thinks podcast possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.